So it turns out luck is very important, especially for short-term results. I like to actually call this the paradox of skill. The reason luck's so important is because precisely investors are so skillful. Let me try to explain this a little bit different way. There's a great essay that was written about 20 years ago by Stephen Jay Gould. He's a famous biologist at Harvard. And it was about Ted Williams, who hit .406 in baseball in 1941. And the question Gould asked was, why has no one done that since? So he looks at some conventional things like, they play at night or they travel. None of those things made any sense. It turns out the reason no one's hit .406 is because everyone's gotten better. And as everyone's gotten better, skill has become more uniform. There's less variance or difference between the best and the worst. So even if luck plays the same role, lesser variance in skill means batting averages come down. And to make that a little bit more concrete, if Ted Williams were to play now, the same statistical equivalent of his performance in 1941 would be about a .380 batting average, so quite a bit less. So I call it the paradox of skill, but it's because it says more skill actually leads to more luck in results.
So Michael, why do we constantly underestimate the role that luck has in our investment success?
This is such an interesting question, because if you look into the future and say to people, hey, future outcomes are a combination of skill and luck, everybody gets that, right? Everybody sort of understands that's the case. But when looking at past results, we have a much more difficult time. And I think the answer to this comes from actually neuroscience. Brain scientists have determined that there's part of your left hemisphere in your brain which they call the interpreter. And the interpreter's job is, when it sees an effect, it makes up a cause. And by the way, the interpreter doesn't know about skill and luck. So if it sees an effect that's good, let's say good results, it says, hey, that must be because of skill. And then your mind puts the whole issue to rest. It just sets it aside. So we have a natural sort of module in our brain that associates good results with skill. We know it's not always the case for the future, but once it's done, our minds want to think about it that way.
Therefore, do we repeat, when we've had a success that we attribute to our skill, do we constantly repeat those same moves in order to get the same result?
I think it kind of gets to one of the biggest mistakes you see in the world of investing, right? Which you say, now you want to put some money to work in the market and say you want to go buy a mutual fund. How do you usually do that? Well, usually you go to a reputable investment firm and then you scan the funds and you see what has done well. And you say, well, that must be the best thing, and often you invest in what's done well. And this is a pattern we've seen not only with individuals, but also institutions, buying what's hot and inversely often getting rid of what's cold. And that ultimately is very poor for investor results. It's about a percentage point per year reduction in long-term results for individual investors because of this effect of buying high and selling low.
So that's interesting. So help us understand what skills really count. If everyone on Wall Street is getting smarter and has the same set of skills, or at least, I don't know if they're getting smarter, but their research is getting better, their analytical tools are getting better. That's what you mean about the skill set has raised on Wall Street, right? So what are the kind of skills that we look at that would differentiate an investor from the pack, from the rest of the street?
So first let me say that in some realms, like music, for example, or athletics, skill is pretty clear. And everybody's heard about this 10,000 hours in deliberate practice. And where skill dominates, that is the right way to think about it. But when you get to worlds that are probabilistic, like money management, where what you do, you don't really know what the outcome's going to be, then it becomes a process. And to me, successful investing has three components to the process. The first would be analytical. And analytical to me means finding stocks for less than what they're worth, or in the jargon means getting an investment edge. And second, and related to that, is putting them into the portfolio at the proper weight. So it's not just finding good investment ideas, but it's how you build a portfolio with those investment ideas. And by the way, a lot of people in the financial community focus on buying attractive stocks, but the structure is actually really important as well. So that's the first component.
Okay, so that's a real discipline and a real process, right? And aren't there a lot of people doing that, though, on Wall Street?
There are a lot of people doing it, although the portfolio positioning, I think, there's room for improvement there. But that leads to the second thing, which is more difficult to do, and that is behavioral. And in the last 15 or 20 years, there's been burgeoning work in behavioral finance. And there tend to be two sort of broad threads to that. The first is what's called heuristics and biases, which is fancy words for saying heuristics are rules of thumb. And what psychologists have discovered is most of us walk through life with all sorts of rules of thumb, which save us a lot of time, so they're good, but they come with associated biases. And those biases often lead to suboptimal decisions. So as an investor, it's really crucial to be aware of what those rules of thumbs are and the biases that come with them, and then work on managing and mitigating those.
So can you give me an example of a rule of thumb that an investor might be working with and understanding what the bias is?
Sure. So a couple examples. One would be overconfidence. We tend to be very overconfident in our own capabilities. You can show this with very simple little tests. And the way that tends to show up in investing is people, when they're projecting out into the future, they're much more confident about the range of outcomes. So they make a very narrow range of outcomes rather than a much broader range of outcomes. So there would be one example of overconfidence and its manifestation.
Okay, that was one part of this process. Yeah, the behavioral process is to be aware of the rules of thumb and your bias and the biases that they have. But then once you're aware of them, what do? You just try to overcome them or balance them?
Exactly. So try to weave into your process tools and techniques to manage and mitigate them. I don't think you can ever fully eradicate them, but just being aware of them and learning about them. So for example, in the overconfidence, you can start to use tools to better calibrate the future. For example, using past data or making sure you're pushing out your ranges appropriately. So there are, in every case, some tools to help you manage that.
And then there was a third part to this, I think, that you were talking about, is again in this the process of.
The third part is organizational, and this is, many of your guests over the years have talked about this. Jack Bogle and David Swenson and Charlie Ellis would be some examples. And here the case is thinking about managing for the profession instead of the business. And what does that mean? The profession means really having the interest of the shareholders of the fund first and foremost. The business would be generating fees and revenues for the company. Now, to be clear, a good profession requires a healthy business, so these things have to go together. But when the pendulum swings too far from the profession to the business side, that can be problematic. And so when you step back and say analytical, behavioral, and organizational, what I would say is many investment firms are pretty good in one or two of those areas. Very few are really good on all three, and that is what you're looking for in a really good investment process as an investor.
As an outside investor, and a lot of our viewers on Wealth Track invest in mutual funds. So how do they judge the analytics, and how do they judge the behavioral, and how do they then judge whether they have my interests ahead of their business, their bottom line interests?
So the first thing I would say, and something you've also talked a lot about on the show over the years, is for many people indexing makes sense, right? Low cost exposure to markets, so you don't have to fuss with it at all. So that is one way. Now, if you do want to go with active management, I do think it makes sense for a lot of people. There are some things you can do. One is to make sure, for example, that the fees are competitive and the organization itself is reputable. But if you really want to drill down, I will mention one tool I think gives a very interesting insight into the process of the organization. And that is a concept called active share. So let me explain this. It's pretty straightforward. Active share says it's a range from 0 to 100%. It was developed by a couple of academics. 0 active share percent is an index fund. So you're, say, the S&P 500, you're identical. 100% is completely different than the index, right? So you go from 0 to 100%. There's a second little dimension of that, which is kind of adds to the cocktail, called tracking error. And tracking error is a measure of how different you are than the benchmark. Now, the simplest way to think about this is that active share is an indicator of stock picking, so how good you are kind of getting down and dirty and picking the best stocks. And tracking error is an indicator of what they call factor bets. I'm bullish on the economy, so I'm going to buy economically sensitive stocks, or I'm bearish, and so I'm going to be very defensive. It turns out when you look at 25 years of data, it is those funds that have high active share but moderate tracking error. So they're really focused on stock picking, not so much big bets on the economy. It is those funds that tend to do best over time. So I think and by the way, there are a lot of services now that report active share, including Morningstar. So for investors that are really motivated, take a look at the complex, make sure the fees are competitive, and then take a look at this active share as one potential way to gain some insight into a process.
What's interesting is we've just come through a period where we've heard over and over again that macro matters, and so that that it's one thing to have been a very bottom up focused mutual fund, but if you miss the fact that the Fed was going to ease for 4 years or 5 years or whatever it's going to end up being, then that you really you missed major market moves. You had this risk on, risk off. I've had a lot of value investors come onto a very good long-term track records and saying, you know what, I didn't used to pay attention to the macro. Now I really have to pay attention. It really matters.
Yeah, the first thing I would say about this is an area of prediction that's been very well studied. And my favorite scientist on this is a psychologist named Phil Tetlock is at University of Pennsylvania, who did an exhaustive study of predictions in social, political, and economic outcomes. And what he found, I think, with beyond a shadow of a doubt, is that experts are very poor at predicting the future. So while I know people are worried about getting whipsawed by macro events, the evidence that anybody can anticipate exactly what's going to happen next is very, very weak. So that's the first thing, is just to be very reserved about your belief in your ability to anticipate what's going to happen next. The second thing, I think Consuelo really focuses a lot on time horizon. So if you say to me, what's going to happen in the next 3 to 6 months, it's just very, very difficult to do. If you say, I want to really think about longer cycles, 3 to 5 years, or perhaps even out 10 years plus, those sort of wiggles become less important. So I would just be mindful. Obviously, you want to be mindful of macro. I don't want to say you be dismissive of it. I would say macro aware, but in some ways macro agnostic.